Hey again, everybody. Master Geek here with another GeekWorld online video review. In this review, I'm going to be discussing an old favorite of mine from back when I was still young in the role-playing game, and that is Extreme Vengeance. It is a game based on action movies. Like the previous review that I did, this is going to touch on what I feel are the key concepts of a role-playing game. And while I will discuss the mechanics somewhat, it's more in relation to the feel of the game than the mechanics in and of themselves. The first key concept is, like last time, going to be the idea behind the game. Again, I'm going to start with a quote that I think best sums up the game as a whole. It's actually a partial quote, and it is, "For those of us more likely to sit through Schwarzenegger than Shakespeare." This is from the introduction of the book, and as I said, I feel it captures the general idea of Extreme Vengeance better than anything else. This is a game where the characters are all action movie actors. They start out as B-movie stars, and they punch, kick, and catchphrase their way up to superstardom. If you've ever wanted to play through Lethal Weapon, Die Hard, Mr. Nice Guy, or Rambo, this is just about one of the perfect games for you. I'm going to now move on to the mechanic system as it relates to the atmosphere of the game. Again, the first of my big key concepts that I consider to quite possibly be the most important is, do the mechanics of the game successfully capture the atmosphere the game is trying to create? Well, there are two all-encompassing statistics called star qualities in Extreme Vengeance: guts and coincidence. In addition, instead of having skills like some other games, Extreme Vengeance has something called repertoires. Guts is the ability to do stuff, from throwing a punch to flirting with a waitress and chasing the helicopter piloting terrorist with your hang glider. Guts is what you roll. Each point in Guts is 1d6 when a roll is called for, and a character's Guts generally starts between 2 and 6. Guts is split between all actions, including dodge, blocking on an opponent's turn in a given round. The player declares what actions they would like to perform. The Game Master, in Extreme Vengeance the Game Master is called the Director, then determines any bonuses or penalties granted to the roll based on how cool the action sounds. For example, seeing a bad guy and saying, "I run across the street and punch him," would probably be a boo rating, and regardless of how many dice you had allotted to the action beforehand, you would automatically roll 2 less. If, on the other hand, you said, I grab some kid's skateboard, see a parked semi, ride up the ramp grinding the top of the semi, and then grab a lamp pole, swing around and use my momentum to kick the skateboard, point first at the bad guy's neck, you would probably be more likely to receive an encore rating. And regardless of how many dice you allotted to the action, you would roll your maximum guts. Now, there is a downside to going crazy with a stunt, however. When you have finished describing your action and the director has given the bonus, he then looks at how difficult the stunt was to perform and rolls an amount of dice based on that to create the difficulty number. The first example above might lower the player's dice rolled from 5 to 3, but the difficulty of the stunt would probably also only call for 1d6 difficulty. To cross the street, combat is directly opposed to rolls between the combatants. The second example would probably net the player full dice, say 6, but the director would more likely also roll 5 or 6 dice himself, and then the player's roll would have to beat that. And once an action is completed, the totals rolled by both player and director are given to the player as experience. In Extreme Vengeance, experience points are known as popularity. And once a character reaches a certain level of popularity, they move up to the next level of stardom and get to improve their character. Coincidence is the other stat I mentioned, and this is rolled exactly the same way as Guts. However, coincidence is used to resolve exactly what one might think it would. Is the PC falling from a building and praying that there just happens to be an awning to break his fall? That would be a coincidence roll. Instead of rating the difficulty to beat by how tough the stunt sounds, coincidence difficulty is based around how ludicrous the idea is. The awning might be realistic, but a biplane just happening by that the PC lands in an empty seat of would be a bit more difficult to pull off. A repertoire is something that allows a character to affect a scene, or an encounter in standard parlance, in a special way. They aren't rolled like skills. Basically, each repertoire, a character, if he has 2 levels of cue card, he can use that repertoire twice in a film. These are ways to vastly change things in a character's favor. A few examples of how repertoires are used. A character is sweating, trying to figure out what wire to cut before a bomb goes off and kills everyone in a 2-block radius. The player has no idea what wire to cut, and the rolls aren't helping. It's then she realizes that her character has the cue card repertoire. So she says she is using that, and at that point, the director holds up a cue card that reads, "It's always the red wire, duh." The character cuts the red wire and the bomb is defused. There's a huge battle being waged between the police and the triad. The police officer has just spotted his baby brother amongst the triad fighters. He keeps attempting to get close enough to confront and talk to him, but the battle keeps getting in the way. That's when the player whips out their tight 2-shot repertoire. Both the police officer and his brother are the only 2 in the camera shot, thus taking them out of the combat, even though it's still raging around them, for the purposes of dialogue, discussion, taking a breather. There are many more, too many to go over in a simple review, but you get the idea of how they work. Now to the last bit of the mechanics, the bad qualities, or no goods as they're called in Extreme Vengeance. NGs are exactly like repertoires, except they're negative, and the director has to make sure that every NG a character has is worked into every film. Again, a couple of examples. A character has fought his way to the lead villain in the first scene of the film, and is just raising his rocket when the director activates the bad bonk NG the character has. One grunt the hero missed, silently moved up behind him and clocked him with the butt of his gun in the back of his skull, knocking the character out until the director says he isn't unconscious anymore. Similar to the example above, the hero approaches the main villain with a baseball bat from behind. He raises it unnoticed and brings it cracking down onto the skull of the villain. The director then activates the defective prop no good the character has, and the styrofoam bat snaps in half, doing no damage. Combat is, of course, the lifeblood of the action movie, and Extreme Vengeance knows this. Combat in the game is fast, furious, and larger than life. A simplistic description is attacker and defender both roll, winner does damage to the loser. While the dice are totaled to determine if an attack hit, you aren't done with that roll yet, so leave the dice as they are. Once you've determined you hit, the director tells you the roll of your opponent, extra, supporting cast, or feature roll. Any 2s or higher are enough to hit an extra. 4s and higher for supporting cast, and only 6s are high enough to actually damage a feature roll. The amount of the required numbers is how much damage is done. Hit points are equal to a character's gut score. Once that reaches 0, they're out. Characters are feature rolls, so you would only be hurt on a roll of a 6. Next is character creation and leveling up. The atmosphere is built immediately upon looking into character creation. When one notices that instead of character classes, Extreme Vengeance characters are made up of something called typecasts. A character's typecast consists of 2 things, a descriptor and a designator. A player chooses one of each, and they determine the character's star qualities, guts and coincidence, as well as what repertoires and NGs they have access to. The descriptor lists an adjective that describes a character's nature and specialty. There are 7 descriptors listed in the book. There's acrobatic, bumbling, grim, gung-ho, maverick, pumped up, and suave. Designators amount to what the character generally does for a living in the films the actor appears in. These are also 7. And it's agent, common champ, cop, fighter, outlaw, scholar, and soldier. Now, as stated, a player chooses one descriptor and one designator to make up their character. I'm going to use Jackie Chan a la Mr. Nice Guy as an example. His character sheet might say Jackie Chan, bumbling common champ. He'd have guts of 3, coincidence of 9. His repertoires would be background specialties 2, catchphrase 2, comic relief 5, etc. And that's pretty much what makes up a character. And leveling up is also simple. Once a character has a certain amount of popularity, the player will look at a chart of the popularity levels and give the character additional benefits equal to where they are. Each level has a name, from obscure lead up to god/goddess of celluloid. I give the mechanics in relation to atmosphere rating 5 out of 5 stars. Next up is the complexity. The complexity of a system can not only have an effect on the general playability, but also an effect on how newbie-friendly it is. Because of this, the complexity of a game is the next of my key concepts as it applies to the basic system, players, and GMs. Complexity of the basic system. The base system is pretty simplistic. You roll XD6 versus the difficulty your opposed roll. High roll wins. As there are only 2 types of rolls and the situation for each is extremely clear, there aren't a lot of what do I roll for this situations. Player's perspective. From the player's end, there isn't much complexity to the game at all. You describe your action, the GM applies the excitement level, and the player rolls the dice indicated using any repertoire they like. The narrative style of describing actions to increase excitement level does have a slight learning curve for those not used to more narrative gameplay, however. Game Master's side of things. While the Game Master Director side is a bit more complex than the player side, it's still fairly simple as far as it goes. Setting action difficulties is proportional to the actual stunt being attempted, so that doesn't require much pre-planning, although the director does still want to determine at what level the stunt difficulty actually is. The director also has to determine the excitement level and corresponding bonuses penalties of each action that the PCs attempt. Like determining stunt difficulty, this is something that can't be pre-planned and is pretty subjective in regards to the group and the director. Creation of films, then, is simpler than in other games. The director thinks of what scenes they'd like to see played out, they jot down the generalities, and the rest is determined in-game. This is definitely a game well geared towards the just wing it type of GMs. And I give the complexity rating for Extreme Vengeance 4 out of 5 stars. I didn't give it 5 stars simply because this isn't going to be for everybody, particularly non-narrative style players. Now, I'm primarily a GM when I play role-playing games, so the next of my key concepts is how useful the GM section of a book is for the potential GM. The information for GMs in Extreme Vengeance is a perfect example of what should be included in a game. Everything a potential Extreme Vengeance director could need is addressed in the core book without needing to buy a special supplement. Extreme AIDS chapter. This is an entire chapter devoted to helping a game master build sets for scenes to take place in, from film-specific sets to generic sets on index cards that can just be whipped out as needed. This chapter also advises the director on how to keep the excitement levels and melodrama going at all times, as well as reminding them that action movies are not reality. The section then goes into world building, touching on the most common genres of action movie. It mentions common tropes that are generally worked into each kind of action movie and touches briefly on the feel a director might try and grasp when playing in a particular style of game. The Extreme AIDS chapter also includes the Quickie B-Flick Scriptomatic, a table a director can roll on to determine a film for the players on the fly without any kind of prep beforehand. Extreme Extras chapter. This is a chapter of the book that goes into all kinds of optional rules directors can throw into their games, as well as a photocopy cutout-able set of effect cards that the director can use to indicate out-of-character conversation, sound effects, etc. The second portion of this chapter is the included adventure, which is discussed next. The last portion of the Extreme Extras chapter is the curtain call. This section talks about each of the big action movie stars of the day. The game came out in 1997. In each area, from Terry Bollea to Chow Yun-fat to Hulk Hogan, who is Terry Bollea. It also mentions several films each actor starred in and the type of characters they played. At the end of this section, the authors talk about books they used for the research purposes that potential directors might also want to take a look at for inspiration. I give the GM section rating of Extreme Vengeance 5 out of 5 stars. Included adventure. This is the last key concept for any core book, and it's a sample adventure included. Ideally, this should give the game master an idea of what a general adventure in the system should look like, while keeping it easy to reference. Number of included adventures in Extreme Vengeance is 1. I'm always a fan of quantity over quality. If it came down to it, I will always choose one good sample adventure over several subpar ones. The adventure included with Extreme Vengeance is called Death Threat. It's the feature presentation of the Extreme Vengeance core book. The sample adventure begins by stating the gimmick, or cool thing, the film is based around, the treatment, or general plot synopsis, and then the cast of characters, which statted and non-player characters of the adventure. I like it when NPCs are statted out right up front in the adventure instead of spread around, because then they're in one easy-to-reference place. This first section finishes by giving a set mechanic. It's a non-art map of the movie set, akin to those created for text adventures. After this, the adventure goes into the plot itself, breaking it down into the main scenes. While other scenes may occur, these are the ones central to the plot of the movie itself. Each section discusses what the NPCs are doing during that time frame, what their immediate goals are, as well as general ideas of ways the player characters could gain popularity in that scene. It keeps it rather vague, which fits this particular game, as much of what happens in the game is character-driven. I give the included adventure rating for Extreme Vengeance 5 stars. Potential concerns. This is a section that it's not only devoted to things I don't like about a game, it's also potential problems that don't really bother me, but they might bug other people. This section isn't rated, as it's even more subjective than the rest of my review. The only main thing I'd mention about Extreme Vengeance is diehard simulationists might hate it. Describing actions is extremely narrative, and in general, the more unbelievable the stunt, the better off a player is. To finish off, this is one of the few games I've given a 10 to on RPGgeek.com. It's a great pickup game for an off night, or if people just need a break from a more hardcore campaign. The atmosphere is captured not only by the mechanics, but by the writing of the book itself. I highly recommend at least giving it a read if you get a chance. Again, this game is out of print. It came out in 1997. I don't know what kind of run it had as far as how many copies were produced. It was written by Tony Lee. And if you do manage to find a copy on the cheap somewhere, I'd pick it up. Like I said, it's just a fun read even if you don't get around to playing it. But if you, like I said, if you do have an off night, this is a great game to just bust out at the table for an on-the-spot game. Thanks again, guys. This is Master Geek for GeekWorld Online with another GeekWorld Online review.